All right, hi everyone, welcome back to the last part of this week on medical ethics. Last lecture we talked about whether or not clinicians can ever lie. Now we are turning to a totally different issue in medical ethics around euthanasia. I had you read from our textbook, the Ethics for A-Level textbook, and I also had you peruse, just briefly look through the American Medical Association's statement on euthanasia, and then also an article from a journal on nursing ethics about euthanasia. The reason I had you just peruse those articles is because I just wanted you sort of kind of familiar about how actual people who work in medicine and in nursing, some of their attitudes towards these things. The reason I didn't have you read the American Medical Association and the American Nursing Association's statements is because actually the ANA and AMA statement, that is the Nursing Association and Medical Association, have very, very similar statements. So that would have just been repetitive. But that article from the Nursing Ethics offers an argument that I think is so fascinating and really only I think nurses can articulate that I wanted you to be familiar with. So euthanasia. First we might want to say, what even is euthanasia, right? Because there's different kinds, and our textbook sort of offers us the types of euthanasia. So first, euthanasia can be voluntary. This means that the person who is dying has made the decision that they want to terminate their own life. Euthanasia can also be involuntary. An involuntary euthanasia happens when what's called a medical decision maker. If any of you have heard of a power of attorney, if any of you have heard of living will documents, these are sort of ways that adults assign decision makers to make decisions on their behalf when they are incapacitated or unable to make their decisions. You might imagine someone's in a coma, you might imagine someone's unconscious, you might imagine someone has aphasia, so they literally cannot talk. There are all kinds of reasons. Someone could have locked-in syndrome, so they could be entirely conscious and aware but unable to move, or they are paralyzed, they can't physically move their vocal cords to articulate themselves. These are all examples where someone can't communicate what they want to happen to us, and so another adult comes in and makes decisions on their behalf, and that decision maker is either pre-assigned by a power of attorney or living will document, or alternatively, in the cases of infants, and to a lesser extent, but still children, those decisions are made on behalf of the guardian, the parent usually. So a parent of an infant in the NICU, which is a neonatal intensive care unit, a young baby who maybe was born prematurely, there's this question about whether or not they should perform euthanasia. The choice of a parent on behalf of the infant to terminate that life or to end that life is involuntary, because the infant itself did not consent to the euthanasia. That's the difference between voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, right? Then euthanasia can be active or passive. Active euthanasia would be to give, usually a medicine. Usually you're giving them a drug you know it's going to stop their heart. You're putting something into their body that you know will kill them. That is active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is withholding treatment. So we have these things called NG tubes. These are nasogastral tubes that go in your nose and go down to your stomach. We connect it to artificial feeding, a tube feed, and these nutrients go in that tube, down your nose, down to your stomach, and your body metabolizes those nutrients. And when you are unconscious, when you are unable to eat yourself, this tube feeding system will give you the nutrients your body needs. We'll give you an IV intravenously, and we will give you saline, which is fancy water, to keep you hydrated. Artificially, we are giving you feeding and hydration. We might also be treating you with a pacemaker to keep your heart pumping, right? You might have arrhythmias, and we are controlling those. We might be giving you medication to control for something else. Whatever it is, passive euthanasia is the choice to withhold all of that treatment, to no longer keep your heart pacing, or to continue to give you nutrients, or to continue to hydrate you. Usually we would maintain hydration because that would be uncomfortable. That's me being a little particular because I know some of you are going into nursing. But passive euthanasia is sort of withholding interventions to allow the body to naturally die. Active euthanasia is giving some chemical to cause the body to die. Voluntary euthanasia is when the person dying chooses to die or wants to die. Involuntary euthanasia is when a decision maker or a guardian makes the choice to either allow the patient to die or to terminate the patient's life. And different countries have decided that different things are legal. To give you context to the United States, in the United States, voluntary active euthanasia is not legal federally. In some states, this is legal. Federally, this is not legal. Federally means on the national level. In some states, this is legal. And we'll say in Ohio. In Ohio, voluntary active euthanasia is not legal. In Ohio, involuntary active euthanasia is not legal. But in Ohio, voluntary passive euthanasia is legal. And in Ohio, involuntary passive euthanasia is also legal. Usually, when we think about the debate on euthanasia, we're talking about voluntary active euthanasia. In fact, if I just say the word euthanasia, and I don't offer more context, I probably am talking about voluntary euthanasia that is active euthanasia. Some people do think that passive euthanasia should also be illegal, that you should take every possible step to preserve life and not ever withhold treatment from someone, even if that means they're in a vegetative state. There have been actually a few Supreme Court cases that have established that federally you do have a right to withhold treatment. Now, I want to point out before we continue, just because something is legal does not mean it is moral. This is a lesson that I just think we should go over before continuing in this class because I've noticed this to be a problem with some of the students. Something is rude if it does not go with a cultural context, right? It would be rude for me to use a salad fork to eat steak at a fancy dinner. It would be rude. I'm not following the sort of conventions of society. It would not be illegal to do that. I'm not going to get arrested because I used a salad fork to eat steak at a fancy dinner. And most people are also going to say it's not immoral, unless they think we have ethical obligations to be polite to one another. If you are a person who believes in like hell, which is like the most dramatic example of moral and immoral, most people who believe in hell wouldn't also say people who use salad forks for steaks at fancy dinners go to hell. Something is illegal if it's against the law. This voluntary active euthanasia is illegal. There are people who think that it is ethical and that it should be allowed. And there are people in other countries where this is legal who hold that this is immoral and should not be allowed. I think ideally we're trying to create laws that are closer and closer to what is morally good. But you should never assume just because something's legal, it is also ethical. So just because a type of euthanasia is illegal, if you think it is ethically justifiable, please feel comfortable to voice that opinion. I will also add very briefly, I would never break the law if I had a real patient before me, and I just really wouldn't. So if there was ever a patient before me, I would always follow what the law says. If you ever become yourself a nurse, an ethicist, a lawyer, you do have to follow the law, even if you think it is unethical. Got that? Good. So the author gives a bunch of case studies that if you're interested in, I would encourage you to go do the reading because you should always be doing the reading. But I'm going to be looking at the arguments. I, for the sake of time, am going to write out all of the arguments in what's called standard form that I briefly introduced to you before, because there's a lot of them. I think there's like 7, 8, 9. I'm going to go for the arguments for, arguments against. We're going to briefly look at the medicine and nursing arguments. I'm going to identify certain things to them, show you how they're working, and then the work of if you think they're good arguments, if you think they're strong arguments, if you like the arguments, how you disagree with them. All of that is for you to work on. We'll start with pro-euthanasia arguments, and then we'll turn to anti-euthanasia arguments. Pro-argument 1 is the argument from quality of life. Also, you all might encounter arguments that are similar to these, like elsewhere in the world. The authors presented you the simplest form of the argument, and I am literally spelling the arguments out for you. These are complex and nuanced. They change for different people, so don't think that everyone always ascribes to every part of every summarized argument before you hear today. Premise 1. If continued life is worse than death, euthanasia is justified or justifiable. Premise 2. In some cases, continued life is worse. Therefore, the conclusion of this argument is, in some cases, euthanasia is justified. A few things to notice about this argument. The person who believes this is not saying anyone and everyone should be able to kill themselves. In some cases. So these are, you would imagine, cases like someone is going to die, they have some sort of terminal illness. It doesn't look good for them. How do we define those cases? Cases where continued life is worse than death. What is the idea here? You might believe that principally life is a good thing, that we should all will to live, or that we should not kill one another. But the quality of life argument says, if someone's life causes them more harm, if the effect of forcing ourselves to conform to the ethical belief we shouldn't kill one another actually means people have continued existences that are worse than death, that are more harmful, the quality of life dips below a person who has no life at all. Even if there is a sort of idea we should not kill one another as an ethical concept in the world, we are justified in taking people's lives under this argument in cases where the effect of forcing ourselves to follow that rule or that principle makes it so that we are sustaining life past a point of more value than death. If continued life is worse than death, euthanasia is justified. This argument only works for certain cases where continued life is worse than death. It doesn't say, unlike some arguments we'll look at, it doesn't say someone always has a right to euthanasia or to death. It says in some cases, only when quality of life, that's why it's a quality of life argument, only when quality of life dips below death. Okay? This is our first argument. If you disagree with this argument, most people disagree with this. Most people think even if continued life is worse than death, euthanasia cannot be justified, if you disagree with this first argument. Argument 2 is actually really interesting because I think it's an argument we don't discuss very often. This argument goes something like this. We have an obligation to only use limited resources in cases where it produces overall benefit. Premise 2, in some cases, those resources are of no benefit. And so conclusion, therefore, in cases like premise 2, cases where resources are of no benefit, we have an obligation to not use limited resources. This first demonstrates an argument for passive euthanasia. Remember, passive euthanasia is we're deciding not to use that tube feeding, hydration, to use that medicine to maintain your life, because those are limited resources, and under this argument, we would allocate those to people who might have a hope to use it and then survive. And if it is a case where you have no meaningful chance of recovery, your prognosis is so slim that you cannot possibly survive, in those cases, this argument says you should not be given those resources because they're limited, and we have some obligation to only give it to people for whom it would benefit. The really dark place this goes, that some people take it, is any case where someone is terminally ill. So let's say that they are going to die in a week, but we can keep them alive for the next week until their heart gives out if we give them tube feeding. Some people say we should actually give them the medicine that stops their heart, so that way we don't have to worry about waiting for the heart to stop, and that way we don't waste resources like tube feeding on them. Another dark place this goes is there's what's called disaster ethics. And there's like this case from Hurricane Katrina where a doctor decided who was going to get med-vetted out of a hospital that was going to be flooded by the hurricane. It seems that most people actually got out of that hospital, but the fact remains a doctor made the decision about who got those resources and who didn't. That, in its own way, was a case of euthanasia. This is an argument he brings up, and it's different than the other two pro-euthanasia arguments. This has nothing to do with the person and their own quality of life and their own right to having autonomous decision-making. This is about our collective obligations. This argument says we actually have obligations to communities or groups or society, and where a person might be taking resources that are not overall beneficial to the group, we are justified in withholding those benefits to them. That's another argument that gets put forward in favor of often passive euthanasia, but you could imagine cases where active euthanasia get covered under this sort of argument, okay? One more pro-euthanasia argument. This is the autonomy argument. So people have a right to make their own medical decisions. Euthanasia is a potential medical decision. Therefore, people have a right to euthanasia. Here are ways people respond to this. Some people say euthanasia is not a medical decision. Medicine is never the type of thing where you can choose to terminate your life. Medicine is always seeking to extend the life. Some people think that's what medicine is. So if that's what you think medicine is, then this argument will not convince you because you just don't think premise 2 is true. Some people might also point out this, right? This argument is super extensive. In that quality of life argument, something had to happen first. The author calls it the condition. That's what philosophers call it. Some condition had to be met before the choice was justified. The condition that needed to be met was quality of life had to dip below death. This does not have a condition. This actually says that people have a right to euthanasia, and that would be all-encompassing, right? That would mean people at any point of their life have a right to terminate their life. Some people think that's true. Some people, though, say anyone who would want to terminate their own life, in most cases, is not capable of making an own autonomous decision. That might be because they're not alert and oriented, so they might not know, they might have had a stroke, they don't know where they are or who they are, and so they might want their life to end, but that's not because that's actually a true autonomous desire, that's because they're confused. Some people might be having depression, and depression is understood in the medical community as being a sort of pathology, which is a thing not right. There's something gone wrong with someone's neurochemistry or sort of how their brain is wired. So temporarily, if someone is suicidal, for example, and wants to end their own life for a mental health reason, some people might say you have a right to euthanasia and still not hold you have a right to suicide because they would say your depression or your mental health issue is confusing you for making a true autonomous decision, right? Your brain is playing a trick on you. So you aren't actually making your own medical decision. You are being fooled by some sort of pathology of the mind. Those are arguments people give to develop or complicate this argument. But those are the three major arguments for euthanasia. Then we have the anti-arguments. So anti-euthanasia arguments. The first is called argument from the sanctity of life. Premise 1, life is sacred and can never be justifiably terminated. So if you just think that's what life is, by definition, then this is the kind of argument that you can get behind. You might not like the word sacred. Some people don't use sacred here because some people who believe this are not religious per se or spiritual. Don't force yourself into that connotation of sacred if you dislike it. you just might think life is a thing that can never be justifiably terminated. You're still in this camp. Euthanasia ends a life, and end is just a synonym for terminate. No one disagrees with euthanasia ends a life. This is going to be agreed upon virtually no matter who you are. This is the controversial premise that life can never justifiably be terminated, right? Notice the same issue the autonomy argument had is going to be an issue here. This is all-encompassing. Just as autonomy brought forward complications that in all cases, suddenly we had to value someone's right and willingness to end their own life unless they are confused, we would have to do the same thing now here with life. Life could never justifiably be taken. In every possible case, we must not permit the taking of life. How do people defend it? Some people say the kinds of cases where taking a life is ethically justified are cases where self-defense is occurring, where you are at war for some greater good, blah, 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 blah. There are ways you can, just as in the autonomy example, complicate the reasons why you believe something and still defend it. But nonetheless, that is sort of the new difficult thing you have to reckon with if you are a person defending this argument. This argument has a few names, and which name you hear depends if you are really working in philosophy or theology. It goes something like this. There's also so many versions to this particular argument that I'm going to put it simply and we'll work from there. This argument can go about 6,000 ways. So this is the simplest way I can articulate it quickly for us right here. The first argument we looked at, which was the argument from quality of life, claimed that death was justified in some cases. But suffering from these cases can be valuable. And preventing that suffering is wrong. Therefore, pro-argument number one, the argument from quality of life, is wrong. Some people think suffering is valuable because it builds character or virtue. Some people also refer to what's called soul-making. This is a theology idea, usually in Christian theology. So there's this idea in Christian theology that suffering can be valuable, and that to withhold that experience from someone can withhold from them some important or necessary experience. Sometimes this argument also goes like, premise one, it is wrong to interfere with God's plan. Premise two, euthanasia intervenes with God's plan. Conclusion, therefore, euthanasia is never justified, right? The idea is here, though, that suffering, for some reason, in some sense, is valuable. A lot of Christian theologians like this argument for that soul-making reason, but there are also non-Christians who do appreciate this argument, so I don't want to act like it's just Christians. I think the author pretends it's just Christians, but I personally know thinkers who take up this argument who are Stoics, for example. It also really only works, though, against the quality of life argument. So if you are trying to respond like to the autonomy argument, you have to use a different argument. This argument, though, is trying to tell you why the quality of life argument is wrong. The third argument isn't really an argument like the other ones. We have what are called fallacies in philosophy, which is sometimes we believe things for irrational reasons. This is one of these irrational reasons. That doesn't mean it can't possibly be right or that there's no value in it, but it does mean I can't write premise, conclusion. What's the idea, though, of this belief? It's that there's a slippery slope. Think of a slope like this. If any of you ever took math class, you know that you at times had to calculate a slope. A slippery slope is if you are here and you start walking down this hill and it's slippery, what's going to happen? You're going to fall all the way down. People who believe this think this is happening with euthanasia. So if we allow in some medical cases, we'll say the quality of life argument's right here. If we allow in some medical cases people to end their own life, as soon as we take that step, we've legalized suicide. That's how this argument goes. If I had to write it out, it would be something like, any decision which legitimizes the termination of a life gives credibility to other terminations. Euthanasia gives credibility to the termination of life, therefore, other cases such as suicide gain credibility. If you believe this, I'm not saying you are irrational, but I am saying that you have to the type of thing you have there is not what we traditionally call in philosophy as like an argument with perfect reasoning. A lot of people say philosophers are wrong and that we should open our minds to possible ways that irrational thinking is actually correct because the world around us is not always perfectly rational. If that's your belief, that's beautiful. I want you to articulate that. But that's why I demonstrated artistically. The fourth argument is the argument for medical advancement. It goes something like this. Decisions are never made in the future. The choice to terminate your life is made right now, right? We are in the present. Here is time, past, future. You and me live right now, and your decision happens right now. The future may have preferable options. Medicine may advance. Preferable means if you made your decision here, you would choose Y, not X. X might be euthanasia. Y might be a medical advancement. Because you make decisions here, but have a potential preferable option here, we should err to potential options. If you've ever heard err on the side of caution, that means we should withhold our decision until we know for sure that the advancement was not a possibility. Therefore, euthanasia is not justified. You should not choose euthanasia now because you might live a little longer and a new option might emerge for you. So you should not be allowed to choose this now because you might be able to choose what you really would have wanted to choose if you had waited. So our laws should prevent you from making that decision prematurely.
Quickly, I realized when I was editing this that I did not discuss the AMA, American Medical Association, or the nursing ethics article with my light board, but that's fine because that's not necessarily arguments I need to write out in the same way. So I'm going to quickly, briefly add this little addendum here for you guys so that way you can sort of understand what those two articles were saying. Remember, I just had to sort of briefly look through them. I was not requiring that you read them in their entirety, especially, they're both very long, and I don't need you to have read all of them word for word to understand the basic point of what they're both doing. The point of looking at the American Medical Association statement on euthanasia was so that you could understand that the allied health professions, as they are, have both made the decision to create statements that are against euthanasia. So nurses and doctors I know, and also a few of the other allied health professions, have these professional organizations, and these organizations have made the decision to publicly not support euthanasia. There are a bunch of reasons given in these statements. Part of it comes down to, those principles we learned about in that first lecture about recognizing not doing harm, the Hippocratic oath, do no harm. Those sort of reasons are inside these statements. But the real thing I want you to take is to have some sort of knowledge that for some reason these documents are against voluntary active euthanasia. I think that is really interesting from the nursing ethics journal and its argument is a argument that I said earlier I only think nurses could ever bring forward, and I actually think this is true. But that article makes an argument, you'll notice, that there's something from the experience of being a nurse. Here's why. To perform voluntary active euthanasia, somebody has to administer that medication to terminate that life. Usually, if you've progressed so far that your quality of life has come below death, one of the things that's happened is you've lost faculty of your limbs. You can't take a pill yourself. And even if you could take a pill, usually the ways would be, by example, perform euthanasia with the death penalty is by lethal injection. That sort of injection would have to be given by, we assume, a nurse. And so that nursing ethics journal says you don't consider, when you argue in favor of euthanasia, you would not be considering the trauma that would happen from terminating a life as a nurse. A lot of people who enter nursing don't sort of sign up for these sort of decisions where they have to actively end someone's life. And they make this distinction between doing and allowing. Doing and allowing is a distinction our book mentioned, but in this journal, we learn that for the perspective of the nurse or a person who would have to administer a medication to end a life, the difference between doing the act of killing someone versus withholding care and allowing them to die is the difference between who feels blamed or who feels responsible morally for the death of the person. In one case, it clearly is the disease. In the other, the journal, the author of the article says there's reason to believe nurses may actually come to believe that they are the reason someone has died. That is a sort of trauma that they didn't sign up for. There's also sort of other things mentioned in the article, things like, imagine having to clean someone's body before they are put into the morgue. We have what's called a final bath that nurses and techs perform with people who have passed. We prepare them for um, their memorial services. Imagine doing that for someone that you just killed. Like that is sort of a argument that this author thinks proves voluntary active euthanasia should not be legal in a way that this author actually seems to think passive euthanasia could be permissible. Some people think that passive euthanasia is not permissible still. If you're one of those people who thinks life is sacred or that suffering is valuable, you might think that even in those cases, you should actually fight so that care, which might seem absurd, is still provided to you because there's a chance it might actually save your life. That's a defensible argument. Some people who have those arguments are only arguing against active euthanasia. This author is explicitly saying, I am arguing against active euthanasia because being the person who would have to end the life says something more than just allowing the life to end. Okay? So those were the two things I wanted you to take from the AMA Code of Ethics statement as well as the Nursing Ethics Journal. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed this unit. I would love to discuss with you if you have opinions or you want to push back on things I said. And I can't wait to see you for next week.